So to our online community, thank you very much for being patient with us as we get everyone back in the room who are building unexpected relationships. I think that's one of the things I took out of Seamus's discussion, is that you never know when a relationship will be formed that could be really, really important to a future discussion. And today we hope to make many unexpected relationships in the room and also online. And as with the STEAM International Conference, it is an absolute delight to welcome Kristefan Minski, Dr. Kristefan Minski from Australia, who has got phenomenal experience from lots of different platforms. So as an artist, as a technologist, as an entrepreneur, as an academic. And I think one of the things I hope you see in the room is that all of those different facets are represented. And they're really important. But building a language, finding that pancake moment, making sure it's the second one, is really important. Just in terms of our next speaker, real passion about transdisciplinarity, and I know that we're going to see some of his journey as his talk progresses. Amazing examples of partnerships from Australia, Latin America, Asia and Europe, I think really reflective of how global our practice can go. And with experience both in practice and in academia, but also as a CEO of the Art Thinking Consultancy, which he's led. And I think the thing that I was really blown away is by the history of driving change. So I'm really excited about our keynote speaker. Thank you for joining us. I hope that the timeline is working okay. We've got a lot of people with jet lag in the room, so you've got some sympathetic eyes upon you. So if I can hand over to Kristefan, I'm really looking forward to your speech today. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for that great introduction. I would just like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people, traditional custodians of the land on which this campus of the University of Newcastle is situated. So, yes, I'm coming to you from Australia, from Newcastle on the East Coast, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here speaking with you today. Okay, so just to begin with, by way of introduction, I think there was quite a lot covered already from your end, and thanks again for that warm welcome. Yes, I wear a number of hats. One, I think really importantly in terms of today's discussion and really important in terms of my background, is also that I'm the official ambassador to Ars Electronica in Australia. And that has really informed a lot of my work and my practice and my research over the recent history. And that's a role that I carry and wear with a lot of pride, and informs a lot of the activity and my work and everything I do. I'm also a lecturer. I'm a part-time academic at the University of Newcastle. It was formerly the School of Creative Industries. I haven't updated that. It was recently merged with the School of Humanities and Social Science, probably something that many universities in your part of the world have also been going through since the COVID disruption. I'm also doing sessional work and have relationships with a number of universities, but I wanted to also specifically mention the University of Technology in Sydney and the School of Transdisciplinarity. So I do some sessional work there, and although I won't be speaking specifically about that in my presentation, there will be an opportunity at the end to give some answers to some questions, and I'd be very happy to talk a little bit more about what they're doing there as well. And also I'm an alumni from the Ars Electronica Future Labs. So that's where I was based and working for 10 years in Austria. And there's a link there for more about my background if you want to have a little bit more of a deeper dive into what I do, and also if you would like to connect afterwards. Okay, so this very complicated and convoluted model is actually a kind of visualization, I guess, of my PhD that I completed in 2020. I'm going to be talking a little bit about aspects to this model today. I won't go into too much detail here at the moment, but just to mention, and I want to kind of let you just have a look at that for a moment, and just let a few of the kind of keywords jump out at you. Things like collaboration, coordination, cooperation, this space between, you can see the design thinking timeline, and the art thinking represented by the blue circle area. And also importantly, this idea of a, as it says down the bottom there, creative outcome driven method, and the open-ended space, which is pointing towards the far left of the screen. But also there you'll see a number of words which I'm sure will be key terms that will be discussed over the course of your conference in the coming days. So this PhD model and my PhD itself was very heavily informed by a number of case studies. The first and most importantly was the Ars Electronica Future Lab itself. That's where I was based, as I mentioned, for 10 years. My PhD research was conducted while I was there. It was a special program between the University of Newcastle and the Ars Electronica Future Lab. My principal supervisor was in Newcastle, that I was working with remotely for most of the time, while I was based there within the context of the Ars Electronica Future Lab, and importantly, using that as the main kind of location to really go deep and unpack what's this idea of really sort of transdisciplinary research, and in particular in this case art-driven transdisciplinary research in an environment that has existed since 1996. And it is also important to mention that the Ars Electronica Future Lab is born out of the Ars Electronica. I'm assuming that there's already a number of people in the room that have heard of the Ars Electronica, but just for those who haven't, and again, I'm happy to talk more about that at the end. It began and started as a festival at the intersection of art, technology, and society in 1979. It's based in Linz in Austria, and it's a very well known, and I would say the leading platform still today for a number of those types of activities across the art, the technology, but importantly for the society, the social impact. And it's also the place where they had developed one of the world's most renowned awards, the Prix Ars Electronica, for the same activity across these intersecting areas, and it covers awards across hybrid art, interactive art, computer animation, and more recently things like artificial intelligence and life art. But again, the focus in terms of my research, and I think most importantly for today, is the Ars Electronica Future Lab. So as I do in my research, I really argue and position that the Future Lab is one of a few examples of these types of transdisciplinary research environments that exist and have done so for more than 2 decades. So there are a couple of other really important institutions and organizations that I visited as part of my research. Some are mentioned there, which are close partners to the Ars Electronica Future Lab, such as MIT Media Lab and also UCLA, the Art Science Lab that is based out of there. And also there's a few other important organizations and partners that are mentioned there. And these really refer to the main activity of the Ars Electronica, which is partnered research, and in particular, partnered research with significant industry partners from all over the world. Sorry, just jumped a bit too far forward there. Okay, so to really kind of summarize it, briefly, the Ars Electronica Future Lab, it's the think tank and R&D department of this larger Ars Electronica organization. It's based around these 3 core principles of scientific exploration, artistic expression, and social impact. Again, very much referring to the main core activities of what Ars Electronica has always been about: art, technology, and society. It's a transdisciplinary team of around 40 members. I think it's still around that number today. And importantly, it's also, it was a very sort of multicultural lab as well, including people like myself that was there from Australia. There was then and still remains today close colleagues from Japan, from many countries across Europe, from also Latin America, from the US. So it was a really kind of a mixed bag of not only disciplines, but cultural perspectives. And here's some example of the many disciplines that were working there. And down the bottom, just a little anecdote that I like to refer to sometimes, but this was a really important revelation, I guess, in my PhD. And again, I can talk a little bit more about that today, but this idea of trying to understand where kind of art sits into the kind of process of what's happening there and how the disciplines are working together. But it was kind of actually more of an approach that revealed itself, which is, I think, quite different to how a lot of interdisciplinary, and I think that's led to how people are describing transdisciplinary environments in a lot of literature are being explained. And quite differently, there is this idea that the sort of the art, the creative activity is what's underneath kind of everything that's happening there. So this idea of art there is like water and everything's getting wet was an interesting statement that helped to inform my PhD. Okay, so the other thing that was heavily informing my PhD were case studies actually about the projects that were happening during my time at the Ars Electronica Future Lab. While I was doing the PhD research, I was also still actively involved as an applied artistic researcher, and I was producing projects, I was collaborating on these projects. And there were around half a dozen projects that were specifically relevant. And I went over and examined in kind of very careful detail as part of the research. But these four in particular were particularly important. And just to mention there on the bottom right-hand corner, one of my favorite collaborations of all time with the Indian UK-based dancer Akash Odedra, and we actually happened to do some collaborative workshops and development R&D work in Birmingham. That was the last time I was there in person at the I think it was called the Hippodrome from memory, which was a very cool space, and I'm hoping to come back and visit again one day. But I just wanted to go a little bit deeper into one of these projects for a moment. So you'll see here on the top left corner, that's the Spaxels project. That was the first ever world record for the largest swarm of drones, UAV drones, in an outdoor environment, and then combined with a high-powered LED lighting system. And in the course of my time also, while I was doing that research, this little kind of experimental project that came out of this experimental lab in Austria had developed into something quite phenomenal. And I like to sometimes describe that what they actually started here was the development of a whole new market. These example images that you're project developed from that initial experiment right up to then the industry partnerships, including, for example, Intel for around 1.5 years. There's a lot of things that you can unpack and connect to not only where that research came from, but importantly, in terms of my research and today's discussion, is also how I was examining that project and again, trying to understand how this type of innovative work comes out of these sorts of environments like the Ars Electronica Future Lab. So here you can see an example of some of the things I was doing during the research. So I would basically go and interrogate the project and the life cycle of the project and really look at sort of different key milestones along the way. And here you can basically also see through this model how I was positioning my PhD research and what was going to be my focus area. So there you can see that front part of the model, which is that blue area, which I was later calling the art thinking space, and was developing a kind of a new methodology, or rather it was informing the kind of conceptual framework underneath what was then later helping to form what was already existing and coming out of Ars Electronica as this idea of art thinking, which has been framed more as a mindset rather than a methodology, a way to combine different methods or draw on different methods, as opposed to, again, what you can see there is what I was describing as something which is already quite well known, and I use design thinking more of an umbrella term for a whole range of different design processes and practices. And as far as I was kind of concerned and arguing in terms of my research, it was also referring to a space which is more relevant, I think, to understanding interdisciplinarity rather than transdisciplinarity. Okay, and here you'll just see some less eloquent examples, but still really important. This is just giving you a snapshot of some initial sketches I was doing for all of the different projects that I was working in, and then I was going into more and more detail. And I'm just showing you now how the kind of research developed. And here I was drawing on existing models and I was doing sketches myself. So again, just down the bottom, this was quite early into the research, but I found myself just getting kind of overwhelmed by all the literature that was around, you know, the STEAM and STEM debate. And again, just to go back to that idea of the art is like water, that kind of came out of a conversation and almost in response or frustration to how it was otherwise being described, and definitely in that space it wasn't really understood that, you know, this is happening in this context of the different disciplines being next to each other. And it was really trying to kind of find a different way to describe that activity. So again, just to mention, that was early parts of the research, but I started to think about, okay, well, maybe it's actually all the different disciplines that are, you know, immersed in this other type of, you know, artistic activity, which is kind of like the philosophical framework, which is underneath and informing everything else. And here on the right and up the top there, these are actually diagrams that were also coming out of Ars Electronica around the same time, particularly the one from my close colleague Hideaki Yagawa, where he was trying to sketch out and communicate this idea of how the work is happening at Ars Electronica and Ars Electronica Future Lab. And that's how this terminology, art thinking, was forming around that same time. And that continued to form alongside my PhD in a different way. My PhD was actually then going really more intensively into also creating, again, that sort of conceptual framework around that, and then underpinning it with also theoretical positions, and also looking at other models. But here's just an important reference, and I think still today how it would apply and be described from Ars Electronica in terms of how it's informing the work that they're doing. But then you can, as you can see through these diagrams, and this is often used for even, you know, marketing exercises to explain to clients sort of how we're working, and this idea of focusing more on collaborating around the questions in the initial space and the experimentation, rather than trying to solve problems and the creative outputs and the solutions. Again, for me, that's really relevant to this idea of open-ended and closed-ended outputs. And here, just quickly, you know, I looked at hundreds of models really while I was developing my own models and criteria for my PhD research. These two were really important, and I did visit the MIT Media Lab, and it makes sense. It was probably the environment that I visited that made the most sense, also in terms of how I think this work was also happening at the Ars Electronica Future Lab. And then I looked at a lot of other models, some of which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. Of course, the very well-known design thinking models. This one on the far right corner again was sort of quite interesting to play with. I was sort of flipping the idea of of an existing model that was created there by another researcher, and this was kind of the process I was involved in. I was really quite motivated by this part of the research, and then, as I am very much a visual person as well, then creating my own interpretations and models throughout. Importantly, again, just to mention, and here you'll see sort of the journey of my research and my PhD, the models were helping me to, also then develop and again align with these theoretical underpinnings, but it was actually more through developing this criteria, and it was the criteria then that I was testing in the PhD against the projects in the end, which was essentially my proof of concept, whereas the model was, and this is again that model I referred to at the start, was kind of like the conclusion of the PhD, and almost like the point of departure of where I would like to go next with this research. And I continue to try to develop this model now today. What I wanted to do now is actually, and that was the idea for the presentation today, was to give you a bit of an insight into my research and what I was doing for my PhD, and then also now explain a little bit about what's happened since that PhD. And again, I can talk a little bit more about this post the presentation, but just to mention that actually this wasn't very well planned. I think myself, like a lot of people, I got caught up in the disruption of COVID, and I didn't actually necessarily plan to be back in Australia at that time. My partner, my wife, is Mexican, and I was at that time looking to go to Mexico because she didn't have a visa to come into the country. One thing led to another, and all of a sudden we were locked down, and eventually soon after my partner got her visa to come into the country, and here we are today. So in the meantime, I decided to establish the Art Thinking company. So the Art Thinking company is a studio. I won't go into a lot of detail about all the different activities that we're involved in, but just a couple of quick references here and how we're sort of positioning ourselves. And this diagram that you'll find on the About section of the site really, I think, gives a good insight and overview that will help to understand also the projects that we're involved in. So one of those areas is certainly and specifically concentrated on the combination of art and technology and art and science projects, but again for sort of social impact and community engagement. So we've been working a lot with councils, and some of this was informed by previous work I was also doing in Australia, but then we're usually also bringing in an artistic partner, a academic partner, industry partner, and then often also maybe some other types of contractors, depending on the kind of conceptual development, and again from an early stage in terms of our process. And this is again to understand the philosophy of where art thinking is coming from. It's very relevant that I'm able to pay homage to the ethos of Ars Electronica, which has kind of developed this ecosystem and has been doing that since 1979. Okay, so here is a quick few examples of projects. I'm mindful of time, so I will run through these fairly quickly. We just completed this 2 weeks ago, the Future Innovators Summit. It was essentially the redevelopment of a kind of a format that I've been working on for a long time, also when I was at Ars Electronica, and it's another case study in the PhD. Here we were doing things a little bit differently. We wanted to focus on kids between the ages of 4 and 19. There was an open call, and sort of positioned them as being the experts of the future. And we created this whole program around that. And some of the images you'll see here are really kind of important in terms of what that format is about. The big one, we refer to big conversations about the future that are not behind closed doors. They're out in the general public. So that's a public space on the foreshore there, where there's a park next door and there's people people walking past and they're able to engage with the conversation that's going on. The far right corner you'll see there, that was, I call that the little UN room, where we had the kids basically in that room, and we brought in some people from different cultural backgrounds to answer questions from the kids across their topics. And then down the bottom, they were presenting then the outcomes of the 4 days of activities they were involved in to a public audience. So we had 3 topics. We were looking at future education, future work, and also future city. And each of those topics aligned with another sponsor partner. So future work was Colourworks Canon, Australia. Future education was the university, and future city was the city of Newcastle. And that's really important because the partners are not just sponsoring in terms of giving money, they're then actively involved in the process. And that photo, the big photo you'll see there, the gentleman with the hand on the face, he's actually the general manager national for Canon Australia. And he was participating in those workshops for the whole 4 days with the kids. So that's a really important part of that process. Here's another one. These next couple of projects were really some of the favorites I've done in a long time. They were out at Singleton. If you don't know where Singleton is, it's about an hour drive up the road from Newcastle inland. It's predominantly known as a coal mining town. Newcastle, the port, exports more coal than anywhere else in the world. It's one of the things that it's maybe known for all the wrong reasons. But of course, it's a very important and has been very important industry in the region for a very long time. And some of the main coal mines are out at Singleton. Nevertheless, it is a city and a community that's going through a process of transition. So I was fortunate enough to be leading a project that was powered by a new lab that comes out of the University of Newcastle called FAST Lab, Future Art Science Technology Lab. Together with Singleton Council, they got some state funding. They wanted to activate some laneways, but very importantly, with the idea of community activation and participation. So this is a well-known project of ours that we facilitate for the Ars Electronica. It's called the Shadowgram. Here you can pretty much see from the pictures what it does. It's a big contraption that generates a miniature version of your silhouette, and then you take the silhouette and a speech bubble and you respond to a question, and usually framed around the future. And in Singleton, we had 3 topics: the future of community, the future of industry, and also the future of place. And that is a really strong example, I think, of a type of artistic activation. The research that was pulled out of this, not only just the academic research and the write-ups that we're doing now, but specifically the council went down and they recorded all of those speech bubbles and how the people were responding to those topics. And they've actually integrated that into some of their strategic planning. Okay, and then the third one, the origami robot, from very old friend and great collaborator of mine, Matthew Gardner. He's an expert combining origami and robots. And he's developed the Orobo kit, which is a kit where you can spend about 6 hours intensely learning really complex origami. But then also to finish it, you're then basically from scratch putting together a circuit board and some motors, and then you attach a light sensor, and the end result is an origami flower that opens and closes through changing light conditions. The more advanced workshop also involves being able to change the data sets, so you can manipulate how the flowers are moving through other data sets. It was a fantastic 4 days of workshops. We created 99 origami flowers with the community, from school kids up to seniors. And then we created a public activation for 3 weeks in one of the laneways. Okay, so just to go back to that model there, again, it's I guess a very kind of simplistic way to explain what is actually much more complex in terms of, getting all the agreements in place. But that's essentially the work we're very much focused and concentrated on at the moment. Again, a university partner, the FAST Lab, which I think is an example of also other types of labs that are coming out of universities, and they are good vehicles also to connect with, to link to these, to link to different partners and researchers across a broader, larger institution. And then on the other side, we're more and more very much working with local partners. But again, as with the FIS project, we're also then, once that's established, we're bringing in industry partners. So just for a couple of closing questions and maybe just to provoke a little bit of conversation. This was the first one. So when I was putting this presentation together, I'm thinking constantly, and I'm working inside the university environment, and I've worked with other universities. I spent a lot of time at QUT. And I know that there's this sort of, real strong desire and push towards transdisciplinarity. But, for the most part, I still feel and see that I think there's a lot of activity which I would more frame as interdisciplinarity than transdisciplinarity. And if it's really, desirable to achieve that, what do you need to achieve it? And I think and feel that it is this kind of idea of developing what Helga Novotny referred to in a paper I think she wrote in 2007 with another researcher whose name escapes me. I'll maybe send that information through later. New modes of knowledge production. So I think they could maybe exist as a different layer. And I think places like the Art Thinking Studio that I'm developing are maybe examples of that. And I'm able to use that studio and have a foot inside, but also a foot outside the university. Makes me very agile. Incidentally, I also use that studio as a way to run work integrated learning programs with students across the whole university. I often have computer science engineering students in the Art Thinking Studio working alongside creative industry student projects through similar mechanisms, but we're able to use that as a way to break actually some of the chains which are still not that easy within the institution itself. And just down the bottom there, if there are any German speakers in the room or online, this came sort of later in my research, but I was quite attracted to this idea of the Handlungsraum, which is one of these great German compound words. And it was extracted from an article where the English interviewer was interviewing Horst, and he referred to that as spaces for action. And when I unpacked that a little bit further, it was quite interesting because the Handlungsraum covers several meanings. It means things like you encounter, you learn through encounter, and you encounter by learning. It can also be used to describe if you're stuck in a difficult situation. And the Handlungsraum is kind of like the threshold between the difficult aspect of the situation and how quickly you can think creatively about how to get out of it. And also it's this idea of when disciplines overlap with another, the horizons can kind of become expanded. And this was all through describing this, trying to understand this term again when I was unpacking that with some of my native German-speaking former co-researchers. Also, just to mention, super interesting, my studio is actually situated in what is becoming a very, well, I think it's now the largest creative industries precinct in Newcastle, and it's a former industrial site that is now home to over 100 creative artists and practitioners. So we feel very well located there. There's just an aerial shot you can see of that space. Again, I could talk more about that, but just also to mention that the FAST Lab and Professor Paul Eggleston, who's originally from the UK, and Professor Mario Minichello, who's now back in the UK but was in Newcastle, they were really instrumental in also helping to set up an MOU between the Clyde Street precinct and the university, which is now looking towards developing a new distributed model of education. The University of Newcastle has had to downsize, I guess, a lot of their former creative education spaces. And now they're finding opportunities to be able to think about having some modules through the coursework where students can go and study some of these areas, again, directly with the studios, professional artists in their studio spaces. Okay, and the other closing question was around this idea of why do we need to break the walls to the outside? And that was, again, sort of was sort of thinking about that from the outset of the conversation I had with the wonderful organisers of this conference. I found this on a presentation I gave years ago, and I just thought I'd dig it up again. I'm not sure how much has changed in the UK since then, but I use this just as an example, at least back then, that was quite sort of relevant also to what was happening in terms of research funding and the concentration of where the research goes in Australia. So, you know, in terms of that, I think, again, referring to the sorts of work that I'm doing and that Ars Electronica is doing, and here's an example from Brisbane in 2016 that I managed on behalf of Ars Electronica in collaboration with QUT. You know, we use art as a way to basically create experiences for the untrained audience to go into some fairly deep topics, and in particular for things that are going to affect their future. So this was like a performance presentation around the topic of driverless cars, and it was directly informed by research that was happening at that time. That was the former head of research from the Ars Electronica Future Lab, Kristefan Minski. It was a major collaboration that was happening between Mercedes-Benz Daimler and the Future Lab for several years on the topic of future mobility. And then we were able to kind of use that research and find different ways to translate that and transition also into the general society, and trying to really create these accessible experiences for all of society. And I don't think it's just within the idea of the context of university institutions, but if there's one thing I like to often frame about what the Ars Electronica does, and nowadays, you know, it went from a festival to being a permanent institution, a museum. It's actually more like a school that's constantly kind of creating ways to engage with its society and its community as part of these activities. And I think this statement from Horst, from a presentation that I lifted in 2017, that was actually a big, I think it was the international conference from the Times Higher Education that he was delivering on. It's available online somewhere as well. I think was also really on point. So thanks a lot for listening to me. I think I'm a little bit over time. There's quite a lot to cover. It was a pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
It was really interesting in the presentation when you talked about art as a compass, which suggests, you know, we need direction setting. And it followed nicely from Seamus's presentation about ambiguity. And it shows that art and design can have a role in traveling through messiness. I was really interested in your point about a collaborative, a distributed model, and that you're working towards that. And I just wondered if I could cheekily sneak in a question about, when you go for those distributed models, there's all sorts of different needs from the different partners. And I think we have different partners around the room, different needs. I wondered if for you there were any key ingredients that you think are successful in helping with a distributed model where you're trying to work outside your immediate organisation.
Yes, well, I can respond to that, I guess, from a number of perspectives. In some ways, I participate that also as someone who manages WIL programs, so work integrated learning programs. I mentioned that briefly in the presentation, but I had been doing that for several years, even prior to my academic position. So there, I think it's really important that, and in this case, like a work integrated learning program has the stakeholders across the university, the partner institution, but then really importantly, the student, and making sure that there's the kind of right mechanisms in place to ensure that the expectations are right from the outset. So I think that's like one really important thing overall. This new distributed model of education I was referring to, I'd be happy to connect anybody to the, again, the academics I mentioned that were sort of leading that and behind that, and Professor Paul Eggleston was the head of the school, former head of the school of the former creative industries. but it's still in process, and I think it was really getting some momentum and was on a really good kind of trajectory, and was, I think, about to be kind of rolled out in a way that, as far as I understood, it hadn't really been done before. But then there was a major shakeup at our university institution, and it kind of suffered because of that. The platform's still there to grow, but I think that was one thing that was really challenging. And again, that first stage was just actually getting an agreement in place, even though it's not like a legal contract. But that took quite a bit of time to work between different partners and to frame that really in terms of how it was going to work, and then in order to be able to take it to the next stage.
It's really interesting. It reminds me of Seamus's point about the first pancake. Sometimes we need to get our ingredients perhaps remodeled slightly in order to make something successful. And it's good to see that, again, the speakers resonating with one another in terms of some of the journeys. I know we've got some online questions. If I can start with those today, just so our online community feel they're incredibly important. Laura, could you just give us the first question, please?
Yeah, sure. We might be able to take these together, Kristefan, because there's a couple here. Which of the models, Mercedes is asking, which of the models do you think describes the best way? She means what are the most effective STEAM models? Okay, we're going to rephrase it. What are the most effective STEAM models was the first question. And then somebody else is saying, how do we see the future of the STEAM industry?
We've given you some big questions there.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
But thank you for the questions.
Yeah, look, I sort of showed something early in the research where I kind of was questioning, I think, the STEAM approach a little bit. And so I don't feel as though I'm probably the most qualified. A lot of what I try to do with the model that I'm creating and using is I think quite a different approach to how I think a lot of people are approaching implementing the STEAM model. And by that, I also mean that I'm kind of, I'm not really too concerned with the rules, and I'm not really too concerned with trying to do it in a way which is going to conform or make sense in terms of structures that are already there. And I think that's why the STEAM approach makes sense and it works. I think it, in terms of like an economic rational approach, because the STEM format in terms of, in particular with education, has worked really well in many parts of the world. And I think that's why the STEAM approach works. And by that, I mean, it got to the point with me, and I haven't really visited for a few years since, but I didn't really feel like I was getting anywhere with all of the literature I was encountering around STEAM at that time and those different approaches. And I think that was possibly because I was also immersed in another type of creative cultural ecosystem that was quite rare. And I guess that what I've pulled out is a little bit different to that. And if I go back to that first model that I've created, I actually, if I go deeper into responding to that, not sorry, the first, but the last, like the concluding model, it's actually to try to also promote something which, if I think about Ars Electronica, is an ecosystem, and that open-ended experimental process and practice that's happening there took a long time to cultivate, and it just wouldn't make any sense, I think, convincing sense in the first instance otherwise for someone to invest in it, because whether that's universities or local governments, they're often thinking in much smaller cycles. So I think that's, sorry, that's a bit of a convoluted way to respond to that, but I guess the short end is I think that, the STEM space is more relevant and makes sense in terms of trying to fit to existing models in a way that have a lot to do with an economic rational approach. And I guess what I'm trying to do is almost like, work on reinventing the model completely.
So in a way, I mean, you spoke before about breaking walls, trying to drive curiosity. You've kind of broken your own walls in that kind of zeitgeist of curiosity in your work. And what you're saying is, you know, it's an evolving thing. And ultimately, you can't just look back at what the STEAM models say, but we're constantly evolving the methodology with art as a compass and ambiguity as a known challenge within whatever we're working. Would that reflect some of what you were saying?
Yeah, certainly. You know, I think part of it's also to do with, you know, again, like other aspects of the PhD, I go into things like the necessity in parts for what the creative industries represents. And again, I think it's a lot to do with economic rationalism. And I think we're in an interesting phase here in Australia because we're just coming out of a fairly long cycle of a liberal government that's had all sorts of effects on the university and the art sectors as well. So it's a bit of a different phase, but I can see why, you know, some of these approaches made a lot of sense. But for me also, like, I can't still really conform to the idea of the creative industries as a whole either. I think that it's to try to constantly frame and create parameters around that sort of activity just doesn't really fit to the way that I think about my own practice and also educating in that practice. So I'm often, a little bit of an antagonist, I guess, but try to do that in a really respectful way, to constantly think about, how could we just completely shift away and look at something completely different or completely new. Just as a quick example, more recently, I'm really intrigued by a academic and creative producer in Australia and called Angie Abdila, who's an Aboriginal woman who's developed this idea of country-centered design. And I found something in that which was like really refreshing and new, and it's quite useful for me to think about also what, as I'm constantly trying to develop with what art thinking's about. But again, if I go back into the research, the vision-led design compared to much more of that, what's often a really short, a much shorter process approached on quick wins and outputs, creative solutions is quite different.
Thank you. I'm just conscious that we're nearly near lunch, and I don't wish to separate our audience here in Birmingham from their lunch, but I'm sure there are some questions in the room. Does anyone want to place a question? I think the lunch is winking very strongly. It's always hard for somebody when they're not actually in the room smelling the lunch. I think, one of the things that's really come out of today is that from STEAM, I really like this concept of art as a compass and, art as not a process where it is the end point, but ultimately as a catalyst that moves us forward. And I think what we're seeing here is all sorts of different approaches in terms of how to use STEAM in order to open up that level of curiosity and to, one of the things that keeps coming across the presentation is collaboration, coordination, cooperation. And you'll be aware from our opening video, these are key principles here in BCU STEAM that really forge the work that we do and how we're moving ahead. So I'd just like to say to everybody online and in the audience, thank you so much for sticking with us this morning. I hope it's been a really interesting session. Do remember that part of today's session is about networking, so please do engage with people and the STEAM crew if you want to find any more about the work here. And we're recording all of today, so you can share with your network and open their minds about the opportunities that are available. But in the meantime, could we just have a round of applause for Dr. Kristefan Minski and his work?